What do you think about when someone says the Wild West? This is a time famous for dueling gunfights, deadly battles, and dangerous criminals. Today you're going to learn about one of these criminals. And it's someone many people don't know about. He wasn't a bank robber or an outlaw hiding from the law. In fact, you could say he was the law. His name was David S. Terry, and he was a judge for California's Supreme Court. Known for his hot temper, Judge Terry was not someone you wanted to get into an argument with. Newspapers were filled with stories of his misadventures. From public stabbings to famous duels, Judge Terry probably should have spent more time in jail than a courthouse. Terry's life tells us a lot about the history of the United States at the time. Slavery, as you will learn, played an important role in Terry's story. His support for slavery would lead to a famous duel and the end of his career. This is the story of Judge Terry and California's last duel.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Have you ever had an argument with a friend that ended very badly? Well, hopefully not. But in today's episode, we are going to talk about two friends who got in an argument that ended in a duel. And the craziest part of the story is that the men in the duel both worked for the California government. We often hear crazy stories from the Wild West, but many times these stories have been embellished in Hollywood movies. But this story is very real and probably more wild than any movie you've ever seen. So get ready, young historians, for this story is about to get fired up.
Our story begins in 1849. David Terry was standing inside his law office in Galveston, Texas. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, Terry was a large person. Some people may say even a bit intimidating. He usually had a serious expression on his face and was known to carry a knife under his coat. Terry considered himself a Southerner through and through. He was born in Kentucky and moved to Texas when he was a young boy. At 13 years old, he saw Texas gain independence from Mexico. As a young man, he fought alongside many Texas Rangers during the Mexican-American War, and it was in Texas that Terry became a lawyer. But after spending his entire life in the South, Terry was leaving. A few months ago, he had heard a story about a man named James W. Marshall. Marshall had been working at a mill in California. One winter's day, Marshall spied something in a stream that would make him rich. There, flickering in the sunlight, Marshall saw gold. The news traveled fast to New York, Maryland, Hawaii, North Carolina, and even England. Thousands of gold seekers traveled to California in search of that shiny ore, and David Terry wanted to be one of them. He was going to California to join the gold rush. Terry wrote down some final instructions on a piece of paper and heard a knock on the door. It was time to go. Terry would not be traveling alone. 20 Texas Rangers and some of his enslaved workers joined him. They began their journey west, traveling through New Mexico and Arizona. Soon after arriving in California, Terry took up mining for gold, but it did not bring him the fortune he had hoped. It wasn't long before he dropped his shovel and opened a law office in Stockton, California. As a lawyer, Terry served an important role on the American frontier. At the time, California was on the verge of becoming a new U.S. state, and there was a huge debate happening. Would this new state allow slavery? At that time, millions of people were enslaved in the United States. Most of these people were Black Americans and worked on farms, called plantations, in the South. Black activists like Frederick Douglass were leading the fight to end slavery throughout the country. The anti-slavery movement was growing, especially in the North. Many people from the North, including free-status Black Americans, had settled in California. These Northerners brought their anti-slavery views with them. Those who were against slavery were called free soilers. Many Southerners, like Terry, thought differently. They wanted slavery to extend into California. Now, Terry was not someone who liked to change his mind or be challenged. He held firm to his prejudices. As the debate continued, Terry gave speech after speech supporting slavery. But in 1850, the Free Soilers won. That year, California entered the United States as a free state. Still, many Southerners in California supported slavery. With the help of pro-slavery forces, Terry was elected a judge to the California Supreme Court. This is the highest court in California. Just a year after he became a Supreme Court judge, Terry found himself at the center of a scandal and a violent crime. That summer, newspapers reported a shocking event. Judge David S. Terry had stabbed a man right on the street. The man survived the attack, and Terry got away with the crime. And what is most shocking of all is Terry went right back to work as a judge for the California Supreme Court. But Terry's biggest scandal had not happened yet. His biggest scandal would happen 3 years later, and it would lead to one of America's most famous duels. In 1859, Terry's term as a Supreme Court judge was up, and he decided to run for re-election. But what helped Terry get elected the first time was the reason he lost the second time. He wasn't elected because he supported slavery. Terry was furious and blamed a politician named David C. Broderick for his defeat. Broderick was a senator for California, and, like Terry, he was a member of the Democratic Party. Although they were both Democrats, they thought very differently, especially about slavery. Terry supported it, but Broderick wanted slavery to end. Although they had different opinions, the two men had started out as friends.
Terry is the only honest man on the Supreme Bench,
Broderick had once said. And Terry admired Broderick for his determination and courage. But after Terry lost the re-election, he ended their friendship. In Sacramento, Terry made a speech criticizing Broderick and the Democrats who supported him.
a miserable remnant of a faction sailing under false colors, trying to obtain votes under false pretenses,
Terry shouted. He criticized Democrats who supported black abolitionists, Democrats who were against slavery. Terry's speech was printed in the newspaper for all to read. Broderick was in San Francisco having breakfast at a hotel when he opened the day's newspaper. He looked down and saw Terry's words printed on the newspaper in front of him. Annoyed by Terry's speech, Broderick began talking to another man at the table. The man's name was D.W. Pearley, and he was one of Terry's friends.
I see your friend Terry has been abusing me at Sacramento,
Broderick said. Pearley asked Broderick what he meant. Broderick pointed to the newspaper and said,
I have defended Terry at times when all others deserted him, and this is all the gratitude I get. I have spoke of him as an honest man, and the only honest man on the bench of a miserable, corrupt Supreme Court. But now, I find I was mistaken. I take it all back. He is just as bad as the others.
Pearley told Broderick not to speak that way about Terry.
I will inform the judge about the language you have used. Do so,
Broderick replied.
I wish you to do so.
Pearley was shocked. Pearley immediately wrote a letter to Terry, telling him what had happened. Broderick's conversation was even printed in the newspapers. Everyone knew what he had said, and everyone knew Judge Terry. Terry would take it lightly. What was going to happen?
Hi, young historians. Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Chen Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
September, Terry wrote to Broderick.
Sir, some 2 months since, at the table of the International Hotel in San Francisco, you saw fit to indulge in certain remarks about me, which were offensive. I now take the opportunity to require of you a retraction of those remarks.
Broderick wrote back. He asked Terry to tell him which words he found offensive and which words Terry wanted him to take back. This reply shocked Terry. He had expected Broderick to apologize. Letters passed back and forth between the two men, and it seemed like neither one was willing to give in. Terry sent a final note.
This course on your part leaves me no other alternative but to demand the satisfaction usual among gentlemen.
In other words, Terry had challenged Broderick to a duel. Duels were illegal in San Francisco, but they were still used to settle arguments. Now, an illegal duel between a judge of the Supreme Court and a senator, that was very unusual. News of the duel spread throughout the city. Reporters were already trying to predict who would win. Most were in favor of Senator Broderick, who was known for his expert shooting skills. Terry and Broderick picked a day in a secret location. Each man was allowed a surgeon in case they were wounded. They were also allowed a friend, called a second, who would check and load the weapons. One September morning, the two men arrived at the secret location. But as it turned out, it was not so secret after all. There was a crowd of people and reporters waiting to see what would happen. Then, the sheriffs arrived and arrested Terry and Broderick. Remember, dueling was illegal. The two men were released later that day, but they were determined to settle their argument once and for all. Terry and Broderick decided to meet again near a lake on the edge of the city. On September 13th, a crowd of 80 people gathered again to watch the famous duel. The sun was slowly rising over the hills on that chilly morning when Terry and Broderick took their places. They flipped a coin to see who got to pick the weapon. Terry won, and he selected his own dueling pistols. The seconds each looked over their guns, loaded them, and handed them to Terry and Broderick. With pistols in hand, the two men walked 10 paces apart and faced each other. "Gentlemen, are you ready?" one man asked.
Ready.
Terry and Broderick responded. At the count of 3, each man would raise his pistols and fire. 1, 2... But before the final count ended, Broderick's pistol misfired. The bullet shot straight into the ground. Knowing his fate, Broderick stood up tall and waited for Terry's shot. Terry aimed his gun and fired directly at Broderick's chest. Broderick dropped his pistol and fell to his knees. The surgeon rushed over and began wrapping bandages over Broderick's wound. He was quickly carried away in a wagon to a friend's house. The surgeon was hopeful he would survive, but the wound was worse than he had thought. The bullet had hit his lung. 3 days later, Terry heard the news. Broderick was dead. But Broderick did not go quietly. Newspapers reported the senator's famous last words.
They killed me because I opposed the extension of slavery and a corrupt administration.
Broderick had died standing up against slavery. After hearing the news, Terry was in shock. When he had left San Francisco, Broderick was still alive, and now it was clear. Terry had killed the senator. The public was outraged. His career as a judge was over. Thousands came to Broderick's funeral. It was the largest funeral ever held in San Francisco at that time. After Broderick's death, more people turned against Terry and joined the anti-slavery movement. The duel was a sign of what was to come. Much like Terry and Broderick, the country was divided over the issue of slavery. The United States was moving closer and closer to civil war. And less than 2 years after the duel, war arrived. 11 southern states separated from the country to form the Confederacy, and a battle between the North and South began. Terry returned to the South to fight alongside the Confederacy. The American Civil War would last for 4 years, and is still one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. history. Over 600,000 soldiers dead, and many more were wounded. Terry may have won the duel, but he lost the war. In 1865, the Confederacy surrendered to the North. Later that year, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. This amendment abolished slavery in the United States. The last Black Americans were informed months later in Galveston, Texas, the place where Terry lived for many years before traveling to California. the place where this story all began. The last Black Americans were informed months later in Galveston, Texas, the place where Terry lived for many years before traveling to California, the place where this story all began. And what happened to David Terry? After the Civil War, he returned to California. As always, he was at the center of scandal. At the age of 66, his temper finally led to his death. He barged into a hotel restaurant and slapped a judge of the Supreme Court. The judge's bodyguard shot and killed Terry on the spot. While he lived, David Terry's crimes filled the local newspaper. And his most famous crime may always be the one that happened on that chilly morning near the lake in San Francisco. If you're ever in California, you might want to take a trip to Lake Merced. There, you will find two stones with the names Broderick and Terry, sitting 10 paces apart. They mark the famous dueling site between a man who was against slavery and a man who supported it.
Welcome back. This story holds so many important lessons for us, and it's a great reminder that it's always important to stand up for what we believe in. Broderick was a man of great integrity and knew it was better to admit that he was wrong about the character of his former friend and risk the consequences. David Terry was a bully and a man who got away with more than he should have. But in this case, the old saying rings true: justice will prevail. And for Terry, it did. Terry won the duel, but lost the battle when it came to slavery, and eventually his bad behavior finally caught up to him. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about famous feuds, be sure to check out Honest History's War of the Currents. You can learn all about Tesla and Edison and their fight about electricity during the World's Fair. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Bruce Gray and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to